Deception and espionage, two tested and tried cornerstones of both ancient and modern warfare. The ability to make informed decisions based on the enemy's strategic capabilities can prove to be an invaluable advantage when trying to tip the scales of war in one's favor. The wits and cunning needed to blend in behind enemy lines, to establish a character and form a bond of trust with the opposing force, requires an immense dedication to both time, preparation, and commitment. The very essence of the phrase, keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer. Our story begins almost 7 years before the major outbreak of corruption within the Louisiana swamps. The 1880s and the 1890s were tumultuous times in the state of Louisiana. Not only was the state still recovering from the Civil War, but corruption and scandals ran rampant within the political sector. This unruly landscape paved the way for large criminal syndicates, especially within the city of New Orleans, where their roots ran deep within the businesses and even law enforcement. In light of this situation, David Hennessy, a young and aspiring detective, took it upon himself to make a change within the city. Determined to clean up the streets, he created his own private security firm, recruited his own men, and trained them himself. Under the exceptional leadership of Hennessy, the men of the security firm turned out distinguished, well-disciplined, and all highly motivated to follow the cause of bettering New Orleans. Through the local politicians, Hennessy and his men were given police authority to govern within the city, and made such a positive impact in terms of civility and order that the citizens preferred his private firm over the local police. Even the New York Times remarked that Hennessy and his men were far more suited as law enforcement officers than the actual police of New Orleans. In the light of his success within the city, David Hennessy would in 1888 be appointed police chief of New Orleans, which opened up new avenues for his ambitions. Being left with what was considered by most to be a corrupt and to say the least incompetent police force, Hennessy would reform the police for the better. Instead of chasing riffraff and low-life criminals, his agenda would instead be to make quality arrests, focusing on high-priority targets, which would make a dent within the families of organized crime. This campaign would eventually lead to the police obtaining crucial information that could cripple one of the largest crime families within the city. However, the ambitions of Hennessy would prove to be a fatal mistake. Having made himself a target among organized crime, one late night on his way home, from the alleys and back streets came a group of armed assailants, allegedly wielding so-called luparas, sawn-off shotguns used primarily as a tool of execution by the mafiosos. The gunmen charged at Hennessy, firing off multiple shots, fatally wounding the police chief in the process. Hennessy, however, didn't back down, and despite the severe gunshot wounds, took the fight to his enemies, managing to chase them off before collapsing. Hennessy was hospitalized and visited by friends and colleagues, but due to complications by his wounds, ultimately met his demise the very next day. The last word to leave his lips when asked who had done this to him was allegedly the word "Dagos," a derogatory term for Italians. Enter Harold Black, the true protagonist of our story. Harold was a writer, though not a very successful one, far too fond of drinking rather than his writing, who struggled to gain any sort of recognition among his peers and failed to impress his employer. However, having followed Hennessy's career closely, impressed by the man's determination and charisma, Intrigued by the very ambitions and aspirations behind Hennessy's motivations to make a difference within the city, and in the light of the recent event, Harold decided to cover the assassination of Hennessy, both prior and after the lethal ambush. This, however, would lead Harold down a spiral of weird coincidences that would send him tumbling down a rabbit hole no one could have ever imagined. Hennessy's death triggered a violent response from the politicians of New Orleans. Anti-Italian propaganda, allegedly sparked by the mayor himself, led a crusade that resulted in the arrest of 45 Italians, where 19 of them were charged with the murder of Hennessy. However, due to contradictions of eyewitnesses and lack of evidence from the prosecutors to prove that the 19 men were at the scene of crime during the assassination, let alone connected to organized crime, gave the jury no choice but to dismiss the cases. This dismissal would spark an outrage among the population of New Orleans, fueled by the call to action of several high-ranking officials, urging the citizens to take matters into their own hands. The spark ignited a violent protest where thousands of enraged people took to the streets of the city, determined to deliver justice of their own. The crowds marched through the city, finally converging on the prison where the arrested Italians were still kept in holding. Among the crowd was Harold Black. However, while Harold tried to document everything to the best of his ability, the situation would take a turn for the worse. Suddenly, the deep and gritty pounding of wood against metal rang out as the angry crowds, with nothing but brute force and violent determination, had constructed makeshift battering rams and began tearing down the gates to the prison. Harold watched as the gate was battered, destroyed, and broken down. The small force of police present at the scene, incapable of holding back the angry swarms of people that now poured into the prison with a violent desire for vigilante justice. It didn't take long before the crowd of protesters returned from within the prison, bringing with them a group of 11 Italians. The men were thrown to the streets among the raging and raving crowd. By the condemnation of the mob, these 11 men had now been ruled guilty by association to the murder of David Hennessy, and the sentence was death. Harold stood by in horror, his eyes wide open as the crowd mercilessly laid into the Italians. One by one, the men were brutally murdered. Some were hung, some were shot, others were clubbed to death before being hung from trees for the whole world to see. Harold was devastated. The brutal sight of the inhuman killings made him sick to his stomach, and he left the crowd without looking back. However, as he left, he saw a tall man, much taller than anyone else in the crowd, whose face told a different story than everyone else's. He wasn't there for vengeance, violence, or revenge, and Harold followed his eyes to the lynched Italians, immediately sensing a clear connection between the man and the innocent people. When the tall man suddenly left the crowd in anger, Harold couldn't help but follow him. There was just something intriguing about him. The tall man, though clearly agitated, moved with such impressive grace and elegance, dancing through the crowd of people as Harold followed him down an alley. Suddenly, as a gunshot rang out from the riot behind them, the tall man took off in a sprint. Unsure why, Harold gave chase and followed right behind him. At the end of the alley, cornered, the man stopped. In the blink of an eye, he spun around and kicked up a cloud of dust that struck Harold in the face. Blinded, Harold fumbled to clear his eyes, when he suddenly, in disgust, realized that he had also been hit by a giant bug and felt it crawling across his face. However, as he wiped off the bug and dust, he saw to his surprise that the tall man was effortlessly scaling the wall of the alley. Harold couldn't believe his own eyes. The man was literally ascending a vertical surface. Dumbstruck, he stood frozen, watching as the tall man reached the top of the wall. Suddenly, the air next to Harold's head whistled as a gust of wind blew past his face. A heavy thud sounded out behind him, and as Harold turned around, he saw a large throwing knife embedded into the ground. It had missed his head by mere inches. Realizing he almost just lost his life, Harold took off running, leaving the man to himself, sitting at the top of the wall. In the coming days, in the fallout of the riots and lynchings, Harold would cover the events in the paper, putting words to the violence that had befallen the Italians. Innocent men killed by a raging mob who had condemned them to die based on nothing. Though an honest decision and admirable approach, the good intentions of Harold would unfortunately not go unpunished, as his boss, John C. Wycliffe, took severe offense to the way Harold had portrayed the situation, calling it pro-Italian propaganda. This would result in Harold getting fired from the paper. Baffled by his boss's decision, a big piece of information would later surface, revealing that Harold's boss had been part of spearheading the lynching of the innocent Italians himself. Luckily, the lieutenant governor of Louisiana, Hiram Lott, would take a liking to Harold and his honest writing, putting him in his employment, which initially had Harold excited. However, the job would prove to be mostly clerical, administrative work, with routine assignments of the same forms being filled out over and over and over again. Harold found the job extremely unstimulating and boring, and brought his drinking into his office. Most of his evenings, he would be found at his desk, almost passed out from consumption of alcohol, going through the seemingly endless pile of bureaucratic forms. Within a short time of his employment at the lieutenant governor's office, Harold would meet a man by the name of Vincent Orsica. Vincent was a tall man who was deeply invested in the political climate of both New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole, and the two sparked up a conversation over whiskey and cigarettes. Being older than Harold, Vincent seemed to possess a lot more experience and wisdom, which he happily divulged. Coincidentally, over the following months, the two would continue to run into each other, as wherever Harold went, whether saloon or bar, Vincent would seem to show up as well, always happy to talk about this and that, especially politics. Vincent and Harold grew close over the following year, and the conversation turned solely more and more towards politics. Harold's work with the lieutenant governor gave him access to much inside knowledge and secrets, which Harold and the lieutenant governor would passionately argue about back and forth, often leading to disagreements. Political rumors, affiliations, current political climate, and future strategies, secrets he would willingly share to gain the respect of Vincent, whom he admired deeply. Vincent would listen to these disagreements intently, and Harold thrived on the attention. The two became friends, and Vincent, being the good friend he was, took it upon himself to better Harold's life, wanting to get Harold to cut down on his drinking rather than spending time in saloons or bars. The two would go on walks instead, and occasionally participate in sports shooting. These walks would turn to hikes, and the shooting would turn to hunting. And on one of these hunts, in a rare sober moment, Harold suddenly realized just how tall Vincent actually was. He had a distant gut feeling that Vincent reminded him of something, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. Harold's health and mental state would greatly improve as he and Vincent's friendship would continue to grow. However, like most things, the friendship wouldn't last forever. In a late drunken morning, where the two had spent most of the night in a bar, with the majority of time being spent by Harold complaining that he was now out of a job again, as the lieutenant governor, in what Harold had considered to be a ridiculous obsession, had traveled to Nicaragua to work on a project called the Atlantic Pacific Canal. Harold had protested the decision, stating that there was much more urgent and pressing issues, both within New Orleans but also Louisiana. However, the lieutenant governor was determined to go, which meant that Harold was out of work. Having seemed to lost interest in the conversation with Harold, as the two left the bar at dawn, Harold was in such a drunken stupor that he was barely able to stand on his legs. But as the two parted ways, Harold was certain that he saw the body of Vincent split and multiply into swarms of something. The swarms vanished down the many alleys of the city, and in an instant, he was gone. Chalking it up to be nothing but a drunken hallucination, Harold was unaware that that was the last time he would see the man by the name of Vincent Orsica. With no job and his best friend gone, Harold descended back into drinking heavily on the daily. One day, he found himself stumbling through the docks and met an individual by the name of Samson. Samson was oddly curious about Harold and his life, and Harold would later find out that Samson wasn't actually a real person, but rather an alias used by the recruiters of an organization hidden behind a veil of secrecy and discretion, the American Hunters Association. The recruiters of this organization would hang around docks, train stations, and other hubs of transportation, looking for individuals who seemed lost in life. Samson inquired about Harold's physical capabilities, as well as his ability to use a rifle. Though severely inebriated, having been trained by Vincent for the better part of a year, Harold felt confident in saying that he knew his way around hunting. Samson told Harold to sober up and meet him at a given address the following day. After a deep night's sleep, Harold decided to go, hoping to turn his expeditions with Samson into a serialized adventure that he could publish. However, as he was introduced to the two other hunters about to make their way into the swamps far outside of the city limit, Harold realized that this wasn't a regular hunting expedition. Harold saw that these people weren't equipped for simply hunting wild game, but rather seemed prepared for warfare. When Harold inquired about their odd choice of weapons and equipment, the hunters ominously remarked that they didn't hunt animals. They hunted shadows, darkness, and things beyond our human comprehension. Harold had heard the rumors that crept out from within the bayous. A raging disease, fangs and teeth in the night, beings of death and decay from another realm that haunted the swamps, but had assumed it to be nothing more but silly folklore. These hunters, however, were not amused by his skepticism. Injected with a dark red serum, its content thick like tar, Harold felt his blood burning as it spread throughout his body. The hunter said the serum was supposed to protect him against the influence of darkness and allow him to survive the expedition into what was known as the Dead Zone. In the area of Lawson Delta, Harold followed the two hunters into Nichols Prison. The now abandoned correctional facility casted an even more weary shadow upon its already dreadful demeanor. With Harold watching their backs, having been told to keep an eye out for everything that seemed out of the ordinary, the group was looking to complete what the others called a contract. However, unbeknownst to the hunters, they were the ones being hunted, 1,000 eyes watching their every move. Having barely made it inside the confinement of the prison, A dense clump of insects was flung at the first of the hunters. His panicking screams of terror echoed among the narrow walls and abandoned cells. As he clawed at the box crawling down his throat, behind the hunter, through his screams of terror, a swarm of insects gathered, whirling around in a black tornado of mandibles and legs. A dark shadow emerged from within the swarm, while the other hunter stood frozen in place, terrified. Harold was shocked and petrified as he felt an odd recognition, seeing the figure of the shadow materialize. With a sickening elegance, the tall shadow suddenly drove a blade through the belly of the screaming hunter, silencing his howls, sending him crumbling to the floor in an instant. Harold and the other hunter opened fire in a panic. The shadow split into three figures, the two silhouettes dancing through the prison before rushing directly at Harold and his companion. Harold struck him with a blast from his barrel. The silhouette exploded in a swarm of insects, the thousands of bugs covering Harold's face and body, choking him as legs, mandibles, and thoraxes cluttered his throat and nose. Through the coughing convulsions as he tried to clear his airways, he saw the blade of the shadow dart through the stomach of the second hunter. In a frantic scream of pain, the hunter swung his axe at the silhouette, the figure effortlessly dancing out of the way before it swiftly slashed his throat in a clean gash. A thick stream of blood oozing from the wound, coloring the brick tiles beneath his body as he fell to the ground. As the shadow once again rose in front of Harold, he saw through the box and void. Within the center of darkness and insects, a faceless head was staring back at him. There could be no mistake. It was the face of Vincent Orsica. Confused and terrified, Harold fled the prison, leaving behind the bodies of the two other hunters without ever looking back. The events of the prison sent Harold into a manic state of perpetual panic. His memory had suffered greatly due to his constant drinking, and he had to be sure about what he had seen. Frantically, he searched through his writings and notes from the prior year, scouring every book, paragraph, and sentence, searching for anything he could find on Vincent. As his search left him somewhat empty-handed, he resorted to other methods of jump-starting his memories. Psychologists for the deep and forgotten thoughts, chemists to access his subconscious, and mystics he hoped could point him in the right direction with clairvoyance. He wasn't sure which of the consultations had done the trick, but finally, he remembered. Among the endless piles of books, notepads, and stacks of paper in his apartment, he remembered a single crumpled up note. The note contained the address of Vincent. As Harold followed up on the address, walking down the alley next to the apartment, the feeling of odd recognition suddenly returned to his body once again. It was almost as if he was recalling a dream he had experienced many years ago. He knew this place from somewhere, but where exactly? He entered the now abandoned apartment, surprised to find it completely empty and in a terrible state. No bed, no desk, not even a chair, nothing but bare decaying walls and an open door to the balcony from where the draft rolled in. As Harold stepped out on the balcony, he let out a gasp as everything suddenly fell into place. From the apartment, he had a direct view to the prison of the city. He suddenly remembered the riots, the prison, the lynchings, the tall man. He glanced to his left, looking down at the alley beneath him, remembering this was where his chase with the tall man ended, and how he with inhuman agility effortlessly scaled the wall. The top of the wall where the man had been sitting was right next to the balcony Harold was standing on. The movement, the blade, the bug in the dirt. It was Vincent he had been chasing that day. An uneasy urgency filled him. Why? Why had Vincent been at the prison? What kind of connection would a monster like him, born from darkness and veiled in shadows, spawned in another realm beyond our own, possibly half to innocent Italians. Suddenly, a jolt of clarity ran through him as he remembered Vincent's interest in politics. He recalled the names of two of the victims from the lynching: Frank Romero, the ward healer of the regular Democratic organization, and Joseph Macheca, political boss of the very same party, a party which worked closely with the governor of Louisiana, Murphy J. Foster. The realization suddenly made Harold see the entire picture, the chain of events all laid out in front of him. The RDO wasn't just a political party, it was a ruthless group of criminals deeply tied to one of the largest criminal syndicates within New Orleans. They used intimidation, violence, extortion, and bribes to get their way by twisting and perverting the trusted democratic system. Vincent had arrived in New Orleans and seen the possibilities in the political party. He had infiltrated the RDO by assuming the identity of an Italian and siphoned the party for information, allowing him access to secrets known only by high-ranking officials. God only knows what Vincent had to do to gain the trust of the RDO. However, the rise of David Hennessy and his competent police force would prove a problem for Vincent. The campaign led by the aspiring police chief was close to crippling the crime syndicate behind the RDO, potentially robbing Vincent of his informants and his place within the political system. Vincent took action and had the assassination of Hennessy orchestrated, but ran into unforeseen consequences as Hennessy survived the attack and pointed out the race of his assailants. As the riots broke out and the mob served their vigilante justice, Vincent's informants had gotten caught in the crossfire. He had effectively eliminated his own inside sources by accident. That was why he was at the prison. And that was why he was so agitated. Not because he had an emotional connection, but because he had lost his only source of information within the political parties. Harold was speechless. Defeated, he stood in the abandoned apartment, a cold taste of betrayal in the back of his throat. How could he not have seen it? The heavy veil of drunken intoxication had shrouded his judgment, preventing him from recognizing what was right in front of him. Harold had not only lost what he had deemed to be his only friend, he had let himself get taken advantage of, befriended the very enemy of mankind. This thing had only used him for his political affiliation and inside knowledge. A spy of darkness itself. Fueled by the anger of Vincent's deceit, Harold vowed to take revenge. Through Samson, he inquired among the other hunters about anyone who had encountered or talked to Vincent. Anything that could give him a potential lead. Repeated among everyone he asked was a single name: Glanton, a hunter who had been chased by Vincent, fought him, and lived to tell the tale. Determined to learn what he could about Vincent, his behavior, and potential weaknesses, Harold met with Glanton in an abandoned church. The hunter, much younger than Harold would have expected, shared his tale of the assassin, revealing that it had been chasing him for a long time and he was still waiting for it to return. Harold learned about its mannerisms, its abilities, weapons, and tactics, comparing it with his own experience, writing everything down, trusting nothing to be left at the mercy of his own memory. Armed with knowledge and with intent to finally kill Vincent, Harold met with another group of hunters and prepared to venture back into the bayous. However, impressed by the massive amount of details and information Harold had been able to gather on the creature, the hunters told him to stay behind, promising him a piece of the bounty if he would only continue his research instead. They needed someone like him, someone to catalog the enemy's behavior and weaknesses if they were ever to win this fight against darkness. Though relieved, ashamed and reluctant, Harold agreed to the terms of the other hunters. Deep down, He had always known he wasn't about to risk his life over a simple grudge, and he was more than happy he didn't have to face the cold blades of Vincent once again. And thus began the journey of Harold Black, who would later come to be known as the Researcher, dedicated to vindicating himself, hoping to right his wrongs by studying the arts of darkness and help destroy it however he could. Among all the death and destruction, decay and darkness, he had finally found the recognition he had been searching for all these years. If Vincent ever came back for him to claim his life is unknown. However, while Harold's research and input would shed a broad light on the creatures of darkness within the bayous and prove invaluable to the hunters of Louisiana, Harold and the others would find out that there was much more to this corruption than met the eye. The group of hunters who set out to kill Vincent might have been successful initially, temporarily destroying the entity known as the Assassin, but as Harold and every other hunter within the bayous would eventually come to realize, killing an emissary of darkness would prove an impossible task without destroying the source of corruption itself. For no matter how many times Vincent was killed, he would persistently return, clinging to the heels of Harold like the shadow of fate, waiting for the right time to strike. Hey there, Hazmat here. First of all, thank you all for your patience and support. This video took a lot longer than I expected. The amount of research I had to put in was out of this world, and I had to rewrite and re-record the conclusion twice because I kept finding new information. So thanks for sticking with me. But an even bigger thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge on Patreon, especially Jim and El Bob, Corey Peterson, Derivative, Lion, Goose, Doc Powell, Hambone, Nathan J. Torres, Spooks, Ghosty, Jane Doe, Jose Gonzalez, Kashi Yuka, Nebula, Nightingale Far, Riz TB, Sir Bottoms, Stas Biestek, The Loaf of Bread, Tim Wright, Tom Hengst, and Ulf Hjelström. The Hunters Lounge does not only support me as a content creator, they also help me decide on future content, and you can join it for as little as $1 a month. Link is in the description below. I would also like to thank both Tip and Rexley from the Hunt Showdown Discord for listening to my mad ramblings and insane conspiracy theories while trying to establish a proper conclusion for this video. And as always, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.